Excellent.
Welcome to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. Now, I'm David Miller. I'm the Secretary of the Existentialist Society. And our speaker this session is Professor Jonathan Weidenbaum, and he's from Berkeley College in New York. And his topic is Martin Buber's philosophy of dialogue, an alternative non-duality. Jonathan.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here again. I always enjoy these sessions. So I'm going to be sort of reading off of, well, I'll be talking, of course, but not reading like word for word like a book. But I have my notes in front of me, so I'm not going to be able to see it if someone has their hands raised. So if of course, in true Buber type fashion, I don't want to deliver a monologue, but a dialogue. So I'm not going to sit and lecture for too long. Maybe I'll talk for some 20-something minutes, maybe a little bit more, I'll see, and then I'll open up for discussion. And I actually think that discussion is the best way to unpack the ideas of any given philosopher or any topic. That interrogation, that back and forth, a way to pry open the ideas. So, but along the way of my talk, if anyone has a burning need to ask a question, to correct me on something, to have me restate something, because we New Yorkers, we talk so fast, just kind of yell it out. Just say, hey, I got a question, because I'm not going to be able to see you for the first part of this talk, okay? So for some of you that know me in previous conversations here in these groups based in Melbourne, I used to be a kind of a perennialist. Perennialism is in the philosophy of religion, it's the idea that all high forms of religion point to the same underlying spiritual experience. And this is the idea of learning that our essential self, call it your soul, your holy neshama, your atman, whatever, is part and parcel of a greater ultimate reality. Okay, this idea of a unity between the individual, the deep self, and the absolute. And I used to, when I was really young, I took that for granted as sort of the sunum bonum of all religious type experiences. And one sort of mystical tradition that kind of emphasizes this, or in some of its forms, would be Hasidism, right? That 18th century pietistic, mystical sort of galaxy of many movements that is still kind of with us today, even though in a bit more hardened form, some would say. In Hasidism, you have this notion of Bitul Hayesh, which is Hebrew for the nullification of self. It's sort of like the equivalent of what the Sufis call fana, the extinction of the individual self into the divine, a kind of, and when I was young, I took that for granted as the sort of core of all sort of spiritual traditions. And I think that one of the best things that can happen to anybody is to be corrected. So I remember I took a course on Jewish mysticism taught by a rabbi who was absolutely brilliant, okay? And I remember, he brought up Buber in conversation, and when I was an undergraduate, I think it was like my first or second year, I was beginning to read Buber's Ayin Thou, and I didn't realize that Buber was a philosopher, Martin Buber, the Austrian-born, but German philosopher, and eventually Israeli philosopher, who sort of, did a lot of work romanticizing or popularizing Hasidism. But I didn't realize that Buber had, of course, different stages of his thought, that his thinking evolved, it would change over time. So I remember the rabbi teaching the class mentioned something about the I and the thou, and then I raised my hand and I started talking about the unity of the I and the thou, how the I attains a kind of non-dual state of oneness with the thou. And then the rabbi looked at me. Of course, I clearly was not understanding Buber's I and thou, which is a good part of it's a rejection of that type of religiosity. And the rabbi looked at me and he said, no, that's what you wanted Buber to have said. And of course, my being corrected, I went back and started reading a bit more carefully and immersing myself more into the different phases of Buber's thought. And of course, the rabbi was correct. And it kind of opened up something to me. The idea that, different figures in a religious spiritual tradition can be very well informed of that kind of non-duality and yet wholly reject it. And this, it opened up my mind to the real multiplicity of different spiritual types and religious type orientation. So what's the purpose of tonight's talk? I do not present tonight as a scholar of Buber who reads him in German or Hebrew and who's going to offer a summary of Buber's thought as a whole and on every topic he wrote on. I saw already in the chat someone mentioned Buber on Stirner from Between Man and Man, and I'm like, okay, well, let me read that and then I'll come back to talk about that. So I'm going to disappoint some folks that know Buber's ideas in a very fine detail when it comes to different domains. So Buber is a thinker with different phases of his authorship and career, and he spoke on many different topics. He was, number one, a popularizer and a romanticizer in the best sense of what those things mean of Hasidism, that 18th century Jewish mystical pietist movement that I mentioned earlier. He was a lecturer on Judaism, Jewish education, and a proponent for a rejuvenation of Jewish cultural life. He was an advocate of a cultural rather than political Zionism. One which eventually, he eventually pushed for kind of a binational state and for an I-thou relationship, and we'll talk a little bit about what I-thou relationships are between Jews and Arabs. So I would suggest for anyone who wants to see the impact of ideas on politics, or the impact of politics on ideas, A Land of Two Peoples, you see Buber's letters, over the time, showing his varying engagement with, of course, political Zionism and the direction that took, often a disappointing direction in his eyes. Of course, Buber was a philosopher of dialogue, and that's, his most well-known work, I and Thou, is solidly in that area. He was a translator of the Hebrew Bible, along with Franz Rosenzweig, another great Jewish philosopher. And he's a critic of the history of philosophy and on philosophers East and West. So Buber's a philosopher that wore different hats. But I'm not going to stress the great majority of these. My topic tonight is highly specific. I want to engage with the thought of Buber in a highly personal fashion, true to form for a group like yourself dedicated to existentialism. Even more specifically, I want to present Buber as a philosopher of non-duality, but a highly specific sort of non-duality. And I want to present him as a strong critic of what most religious and contemplative type philosophers take as a non-dual spiritual philosophy, okay? I will, of course, unpack a lot of this in due time. So what I want to do is I want to concentrate the most on Buber's existential philosophy of dialogue, based mostly upon his most lauded and influential philosophical work, who this year is now 100 years old. So it came out in 1923, Martin Buber's I and Thou, okay? But no chapter of Buber's thought is ever truly left behind. So I may make occasional reference to his other works, particularly his devotion to Hasidism, okay? I begin with a highly brief synopsis, which I'll then subsequently unpack in various directions. I love this story. So in Germany, before the outbreak of World War I, this is a very popular story for those who know Buber, but for those who don't. So Buber is sitting in his home. A young man knocks on his door in the early morning. The young man, by the way, is a soldier. The young man enters Buber's home. Of course, Buber brings the man in his home. The young man simply asks Professor Buber a bunch of questions. Buber answers them as a professor to student. I mean, cordial, polite. And then the young man went off and committed suicide. And Buber was deeply, deeply distraught. And people asked him, what are you distraught about? I mean, the guy came by, he asked you questions, you answered his questions, what's the problem? And Buber's answer was along the lines that, he had answered the questions the man asked, but he failed to answer the question the man didn't ask, okay? That the man was there, the young man was there not to ask questions about lectures or about Buber's philosophy. It was a cry for help of some kind. And Buber felt that he was not truly present to this individual. And I, as a teacher, I've had experiences like this too, not of students, God forbid, committing suicide, but, when someone comes to speak to me and I can tell that if I'm truly present to that person, not simply in an artificial and functional relationship of teacher to student, but if I open myself to that person as a human being, I realize that that person's communicating to me something between the words, deeper than the words, even if it's through the words. Okay, so I and thou, Buber's philosophy of dialogue, whether it's an I and thou or between men and men, or his later thought that would unpack this in various directions, speaks about two different modalities of our existence, two different kinds of relationships to the world. One is known as the I-it relationship, where most of us live most of our lives. This is our more practical relationship to people and things, relationships based upon either utility, in regard to the thing's usefulness or lack of usefulness to us, or one in which the other is strained through our usual concepts, walking to work, I pass a tree, I pass a puddle, the puddle is simply an obstacle. It's something for me to walk around. Or maybe I look at the tree and I see the tree as affording me wood. By the way, I'm using tree as an example, but it's actually one of Buber's earliest and most vibrant examples. I was going to actually read from I and thou, but I'm not going to do that. No one wants to be read to, Different than I-it relationships are I-thou relationships. And this is constituted by open and receptive relationships to what is other than us. One in which the person or thing is received in their wholeness, without regard to questions of their mere use. So this is sort of this is a relationship of pure receptivity, of mutuality, of openness, of immediacy. We receive something in its wholeness. We open ourselves up to it in such a way that we even put ourselves at risk in a personal fashion. So these are two different modes, and we have to avoid a bunch of things that are often said of these two. Some have tried to claim, who only read I and thou very superficially, that sort of I-it modalities is evil, whereas I-thou relationships are necessarily good, and that's really not the case. We need I-it relationships. We need practical, functional, utilitarian, objectifying relationships to live in the world. We need to manipulate, we need to maneuver, we need to live our lives in such a way that the subject pole has a kind of mastery, maneuvering our way through the world. Evil for Buber was not I-it relationships. Evil is only where our lives become so predominated by I-it relationships that there's a total eclipse of the more open and receptive relationship to things in which our whole being is involved. And that is to say, a form of life in which there is no I-thou relationship. It's completely eclipsed by strictly relationships that are purely objectifying in nature. Okay, and Buber was above all a philosopher of religion. So whereas any kind of I-thou relationship you can foster, walking on my way to work, I may take a moment or two to look at the tree, let's say, or look at the early morning sun reflecting on the pond, and appreciate it without sort of chopping it up into categories or looking at it in regards to its use for me, but simply opening myself up to it. For Buber, you can have I-thou relationships to human beings, to works of art, to animals, to nature. We're going to compare Buber later to a philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, for whom our proper relation to the other really is that of what he calls the face, and really is only another human being. So for Buber, in this regard, is a bit more inclusive in this fashion. But any kind of I-thou relationship can lapse back into an I-it one. Taking a minute with my cup of coffee to look at the tree in its wholeness, or the early morning sun reflecting on the puddle. But then all of a sudden I remind myself I have to go to work, and once again I just pass it by as something purely functional, and I treat it with an I-it relationship. That's, again, the vast majority of our lives are lived in the I-it mode. Whereas I-it relationships never have to become I-thou ones. Okay, so there is something still special about fostering an I-thou relationship to things. For Buber, God is the eternal thou. God is that end of every I-thou relationship that can never kind of revert back to an I-it relationship. And this is absolutely crucial. And at some point in this talk, I want to talk a little bit more about Buber's relationship to that movement called Hasidism, and Buber's unique sort of religious orientation, one in which the divine is not experienced as something above the world, beneath the world, more real than the world, but rather through our concrete relationships to others. So the idea is, again, while the great bulk of our relationships to the world are I-it relationships, relationships of pure utility, purely functional, objectifying, we also have the capacity for a kind of open, mutual, receptive type relationship to the world, one in which our whole being is entailed. And of course, within each I-thou relationship is the intimations of the eternal thou, okay? The divine that is experienced in and through our concrete relationships to the world. So now, some interesting features here that I might return to toward the end of this talk. Some wonderful quotes. Buber states at one point in I and Thou, all real living is meeting, okay? And also a phrase he uses more than once, the spirit is not within us, but between human beings. So the between is a real category in I and Thou, okay? But he talks about something called the between. He also talks about it between man and some of his other works. Well, the between is, there is something ontological about, or metaphysical about, the notion of the between, that when one human being engages in a dynamic relationship with others, that is the I-thou relation, there is the between, but the between should never, ever be understood as sort of like a whole in which the I and the thou dissipate or disappear into. It's not to be reified into some kind of underlying one or substance. Buber is not a monist, okay? Nor is he a pantheist, but that gets complicated too. And we'll talk about that in a minute or two, hopefully. So the I and the thou always remain distinct. A full-blooded I is needed to relate itself to a thou. No different than how the I, different, but in one regard, similar to how an I relates to an it, But in authentic I-thou relationships where you have what's called the between is, again, is a dynamism of relationship that occurs when two human beings engage in mutual I-thou relation to each other, or when I engage in an I-thou relation to a tree or to a work of art. But again, the I and the thou remain distinct. The between is not a kind of unity. It's not a oneness. So what kind of non-duality is present in the thought of Buber in this I-thou, I-it picture? What I want to do is, because that's the real substance of my talk, I want to talk about three sorts of non-duality present in Martin Buber. And in a little while, Buber's explicit rejection of the kind of more commonly recognized kind of non-duality spoken of by religious and mystical traditions, which talk about a complete immersion or loss of the self into the all or the one, okay? Like an Advaita Vedanta or systems of thought like this. But we're getting ahead of myself here. So I want to talk about the three sorts of non-duality present in Buber. Against standard subject-object duality, that of a scientist looking at a chemical compound, or a lawyer looking through a text. The I in the I-it, like that, the I in the I-it relationship is different than the I in the I-thou relationship. Buber states at one point in I and Thou, the I in the I-it relationship can never be spoken with its full being. It's your kind of calculative ego. It's maybe the thinking self. It's the manipulative subject pole of our experience that's engaged in I-it relationships. When I engage in, strictly relationships of utility, of functionality, okay? But in I-thou relationships, it's the whole self, that the whole human being that comes into play in an I-thou, my whole being, so to speak, that allows itself to be affected by the other, as I look at a tree during twilight or the early morning sun reflecting in a pond, okay? Or had Buber really been present to the young man in his home that fateful morning, okay, then he would have, experienced the other human being with the fullness of his being and maybe felt a little bit of the pain of the other person. So there is something about the nature of the different forms of relationship that sort of shape, have a role in the nature of the I that does the experiencing, but also the way the other is received. You know, if in a purely practical I-it relationship, when I look at a tree in Martin Buber's example, I may look at it in regards to, you know, its scientific properties. I may look at it in regards to what kind of tree that it is. You know, can it afford me lumber? Is it an obstacle on the way to work? You know, you're looking at it, kind of dicing it into one of its features. Whereas if you're in an I-thou or receptive relationship, you receive it in its wholeness, so to speak, in a different kind of fashion. So I-it and I-thou relationships, the other is received differently, and the I becomes different between the two relationships. A second sort of non-duality. There is a union in the I-thou relation, but it is not a union or unity of the I with its thou, but the unity is within the I as it reaches out toward its thou. That is to say, you know, where the I-it relationship in functional is connected to the earlier thing I mentioned. In our purely functional relationships to other things, it's a fragment in self that comes into play here. Whereas again, in an I-thou relationship, there's a kind of a unity that comes over the person. My whole being becomes unified as I reach out to my thou. And a third kind of non-duality, the divine in Buber, and this is something I mentioned earlier, is found neither above the mundane world nor beneath it as some cosmic or transcendental ground, but in and through the mundane. Okay, Buber talks about what he calls the hallowing of life. Again, this shows how he draws upon Hasidism, a great Jewish mystical movement that I've mentioned already of quite a few times. So a little bit of background, you know, this is kind of a talk all its own. The Jewish mystical tradition has many chapters to it. And if anyone here ever studied Lurianic Kabbalah, the word Kabbalah means the received wisdom of the tradition. It's the general name given to the Jewish mystical tradition, of which books like the Zohar are very important. In the 16th century, there was a Jewish mystic named Isaac Luria. And Isaac Luria came up with this beautiful mythos. Well, we call it a mythos. I don't think Luria and his followers called it that, in which before creation, God's light had filled up the whole cosmos, and God needed to find room to create the universe. So he enacted what's called Tzimtzum, or a contraction. He withdrew a part of his being to make a space in which to create the universe. And then, of course, he created these vessels in order to contain his light. You can already kind of see the mythological language. But unfortunately, as God began to spill his light into this void, into these vessels, the light was too strong, the vessels shattered, and you have these bits of light scattered into the void, okay? And the goal of human existence is through carrying out the mitzvah. By the way, I'm totally abbreviating Lurianic Kabbalah to a great degree. I'm only giving you just enough background to appreciate where Buber is coming from with this idea of the hallowing of life. So this idea is that, you know, it's the goal of human existence to enact what's called tikkun olam, to repair the cosmos, that through mitzvot, through good deeds, through ritual acts, you're able to release these sparks from their entrapment within the kilopot, within these sort of hardened shells, and restore them to their transcendent source. So in the 18th century, some 200 years after Isaac Luria, a central feature of Hasidic teaching is not to have a despairing idea that somehow a God whose light is shattered and lost in the void, but kind of a joyous one. This idea that the divine is found within nature, within the world, and that, you know, through joy, through a kind of through the release of certain human energies, you can sort of free, so to speak, the sparks within the world. And again, so you can see the divine is found within the world. So the idea is a redemptive picture of things, one where the goal is not to escape or unite oneself to some transcendental ground, but somehow reveal the divine through nature, through the world. You know, and that's a very that kind of, you see the joyful, almost a spiritual, this worldly emphasis on this facet of Hasidism. By the way, Buber's interpretation of Hasidism came under challenge the great Jewish philosopher, the great Jewish scholar of mysticism, Gershom Scholem, and Buber had a kind of famous back and forth. But we're not here to assess Buber's interpretation of Hasidism, of how accurate it is, or later on his interpretation of Buddhism or what have you. But simply it illustrates, Buber's notion that sort of the divine is this is his unique form of non-duality. The divine is found within our concrete relationships to others. The glimpses of the eternal thou come through, or communion with the eternal thou comes through our I-thou relationship to the world, to other human beings, to nature, to life. Okay, I hope that made some sense. Like that waxed a little lyrical there, but okay. Now, one very interesting section of I and Thou is chapter 3 or book 3 of I and Thou, where Buber really kind of, sort of goes into some detail in his philosophy of religion, his view of God. And, and here we find some explicit criticism of sort of the non-dual unitary form of mysticism that most of us think of when we think of non-duality. Again, perfect example, if you study South Asian philosophy, Advaita Vedanta, Advaita means non-dual. Shankara, the 8th or 9th century South Asian or Indian philosopher, the interpreter of the series of holy books called the Upanishads, Shankara argued that the Atman, or the soul, is part and parcel of Brahman, the absolute ultimate reality, and that the meaning of the spiritual life is a kind of a waking up to understanding that the world you see around you, insofar as you take it as a real concrete world of multiplicity, is Maya, illusion. All right, that all things are part of Brahman, and that your true self or deep soul is nothing else than Brahman. They are one and the same. So throughout I and Thou, well, that's one example of sort of non-dual unitary type of mysticism that Buber criticizes. Throughout I and Thou, Buber rejects any attempt to either dissolve the other into the self or the self into the other, even though he talks about this thing called the between, which is sort of the relational, the sort of the relation of the I to the thou. The I never becomes one with the thou. This is what the rabbi meant in that class when he said, no, that's what you wanted Buber to have said, when I tried to kind of fit Buber into that sort of self-transcending mysticism that Buber actually rejects. So in the third part of I and Thou, Buber openly criticizes that religious sort of mysticism, which either attempts to form a unity between the soul and God, or think of Meister Eckhart talking about how the ground of the soul and the Godhead are one and the same, or somehow the divine enters into the ground of the soul. Or B, which claims that the self is already one with the absolute, with all otherness or concrete existence as simply an illusion. I just spoke about Advaita Vedanta as an example of this. Buber calls these sorts of contemplative mysticisms philosophies of immersion. They are based upon an error and a falsification of our experience, and a retreat from the living relationships which form the real heart of all vital and spiritual life. Buber talks in this section about how sometimes in an I-thou relation, the experience could be so overwhelming that it creates the illusion that the I and the thou have now dissipated as separate realities and they become one. But of course, that is not the case. One point, after talking about this sort of ecstatic, sort of otherworldly type of mysticism, Buber writes, but what is greater for us than all enigmatic webs at the margins of being is the central actuality of an everyday hour on earth, with a streak of sunshine on a maple twig and an intimation of the eternal you. In some translations of I and Thou, it's I and you, by the way. Okay, anyway, at one point, Buber attributes this doctrine of immersion that he's been criticizing to the Buddha. And again, I need to make clear, I'm not here assessing how accurate or how on point Buber's interpretation of Buddhism is. Okay, it's more of an emphasis on what Buber has to say. Buber goes so far as to quote the Buddha. I proclaim, friends, says the Buddha, that in this fathom-sized, feeling-afflicted ascetic's body dwell the world and the origin of the world, and the annulment of the world, and the path that leads to the annulment of the world. That is to say, the universe, its origin, its annihilation, it's within us, it's within the self. in Buber's response to this, certainly the world dwells in me as a notion, just as I dwell in it as a thing. But that does not mean that it is in me, just as I am not in it. The world and I include each other reciprocally. This contradiction for thought, which inheres in the it relation, is annulled by the you relation, which detaches me from the world in order to relate me to it. That is to say, this is a kind of a key aspect of Buber's thought. We find something similar in Levinas as well. There has to be a kind of preliminary collection of ourselves away from any kind of facile oneness in order to truly relate me to the other. Okay, so a little bit of separation is a necessary prerequisite for authentic relationships. In any case, there are, it's very tempting when you talk about Buber to, even if you're talking about his philosophy of dialogue, to draw connections to his other works. Buber would sort of kind of relate some of these types of ideas, both before and after he wrote I and Thou, to the history of religion. Buber's discussion of the history of Judaism is particularly rich for me. He kind of draws a distinction between what he sees as a kind of creative and vital underground of the religion, which is the true core of it, and an official overground, or a sort of a more dogmatic kind of overlay. So for Buber, the true Judaism were the Hebrew prophets, the Essenes, early Christianity. This is something which enamored Buber to many Christian scholars. He had very positive things to say about Jesus, who we saw as a Jew to the core. But of course, for Buber, Jesus is one who stressed faith as a kind of trust in the divine, not the adherence to a particular idea, which we find in more institutionalized Christianity. And of course, Hasidism, which was, Hasidism, which was persecuted by the sort of a more legalistic type Jewish movement of the time. So something of I thou relations, Buber would kind of, both before I and thou and after, would, would use as a kind of way to kind of assess history of religion, a social political philosophy, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Interesting that for those of you who study Jewish thought and philosophy, when you talk about the Jewish existentialist Martin Buber is the most well-known, but Franz Rosenzweig, the Star of Redemption, another, Emil Fackenheim, yet another. Buber and Rosenzweig together began to translate the Hebrew Bible. Then long after Rosenzweig died, Buber completed it, but the two men disagreed on the status of halacha, or Jewish law. For Rosenzweig, halacha is central for Jewish practice, whereas for Buber, simply more the I-thou relationship between humankind and God is the real living core of it. With something like halakha or Jewish law is simply at best a mere expression of it, but even a hindrance to it. But anyway, we're getting ahead. These are topics I'm getting a little sort of self-indulgent here. It really requires a greater treatment than one that I'm really setting out to talk about here. But back to more of Buber's I-thou relationship and his unique form of non-duality. It's really, really kind of tempting to compare Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas. All right, so wow, I'm talking a lot here, aren't I? All right, you know what? If you'll bear with me for a little bit more, hope I'm not really putting you to sleep. In our time, Buber has lost something of his vogue in Jewish philosophy and in philosophy in general. One hears in regards to philosophies of religion which talk about the transcendent and our relationship to the divine, especially when it's through other human beings, and philosophical ethics. Emmanuel Levinas is a bit more fashionable these days, the author of Totality, Infinity, and Otherwise Than Being. Levinas, if Buber talks about an I reaching out to its thou, Levinas would talk about our concrete relationships to other human beings in the mode of the face. Of course, Levinas doesn't mean your literal nose, eyes, and mouth, but simply our concrete encounters with other human beings, which thrusts upon us a kind of moral imperative. That maybe in the future, if I don't bore you to tears, then Dave Miller would have me back. We can talk about Levinas. But, it's interesting to compare. It helps to bring out some of the more fine-grained details of Buber's philosophy of I-thou relationships by comparing it with Emmanuel Levinas. So in Totality and Infinity, Levinas offers, like Buber does, a phenomenology, a descriptive sort of description of experience of our encounters with other human beings, although both philosophers did not like the word experience, but they thought that was still objectifying language for Buber, the language of Ayit. But our concrete encounters with other human beings and rich descriptions of it. For Levinas, the other human being is encountered in the mode of height. That is to say, when we encounter the stranger, the other, they place on us a kind of moral imperative. That is, and he loves this language of looking at the widow, the orphan, and the poor. That is to say, to encounter another human being necessarily places that human being over us in regards to that somehow that each of us find ourselves have this unsatiable obligation for the other person. So, and in that regard, Emmanuel Levinas stresses sort of the asymmetrical relationship between two human beings. And he finds Buber's I-thou relationship there's too much about mutuality there. They're almost like they're placed on the same even field. And in that regard, Levinas would remark on the reversibility of Buber's I-thou relation. That in a way that the two terms I and a thou they're placed on the same level, they can kind of be reversed. There's no asymmetry. There's no sort of experience of height. There's no experience of the sort of the strong obligation I have to that other, to put him above myself, so to speak. Now, many would say that this is kind of an unfair treatment of Buber. Okay, and yet, however, yet one more distinction between the two. For Emmanuel Levinas, the face is only of another human being. For Buber, on the other hand, you can have an I-thou relationship to anything, to works of art. Some of the richest descriptions of I and thou is Buber describing an I-thou relationship to a tree, as I mentioned before, a cat, or even works of art, like I mentioned. Okay. So in any case, I was going to talk a little bit more about how Buber affords us sort of resources for a religious naturalism. That is to say, a philosophy of religion which eschews the supernatural, or even this idea of something, a deep metaphysical ground, or the transcendental. How, when Buber talks about the spirit as something not within us, but simply between us, something that occurs in the natural dynamic relationships between myself and what is not me. It affords us a philosophy of religion that you can almost look at it like, as some have called it, like an everyday mysticism. Buber may be a strong critic of the otherworldly and supernaturalistic forms of mysticism, or the kind of mysticism which sort of promotes the transcending of the self, or unity between the self and the divine. But nonetheless, one can discern in the thought of Buber a kind of an everyday mysticism, one in which, of course, as discussed throughout today's talk or tonight's talk, the divine is encountered in and through our concrete relationships to others. All right. So I don't know. I think I've been talking now. My God, was it 38 minutes? So how about I'll field questions. Hopefully that some of that was clear. And
well, thank you, Professor Jonathan Weidenbaum, for your presentation on Martin Buber's philosophy of dialogue and alternative non-duality.
Yes. So